W. H. Auden's poem Musee de Beaux was published in 1940. The poem explores the enduring human response to tragedy and challenges the accepted categorization of ordinary life experiences. The poem's title refers to the Museum of Fine Arts in Brussels, an institution Auden visited in 1938. While there, he viewed the Bruegel alcove, which contains a number of works, including Icarus, the canvas the poem refers to in detail. Drawing on this and other paintings, Auden articulates an idea of human nature which the poem indicates transcends time and space. The poem is written in free verse. In Auden's lyric, the long irregular lines, subtly enforced by the irregular end rhyme pattern, create a casual conversational air, more prosaic than poetic, and a somewhat blazed tone which is reflective of the benign world illustrated in Bruegel's art. Appearing to be the antithesis of the sonnet, the poem does reflect the Petrarchan sonnet form in one way. Auden's poem is distinguished by two parts, which relate to one another much like an octave and sestet of a sonnet. Thus, like a sonnet, the poem is marked by a definite break or turn in thought. The first 13 lines of the poem introduce the poem's theme and discuss it in general terms, while the second half of the poem develops and illustrates the general idea with a specific example. Let's see the summary of the poem. The poem opens with a very general statement which establishes the distinguishing quality of the first section of the poem. Auden does this by categorizing all artists of the Renaissance period into one group, old masters, by disregarding their country of origin. Flemish artists versus Italian painters, for instance, and their pictorial depiction the common or everyday scenes of many Flemish artists as opposed to human suffering popular with Italian painters, the poet establishes a broad historical perspective. In doing so, the poem implies a universal truth that all artists agree upon the significance and understanding of suffering, and as the opening line states, their perspective is never wrong. In line 3 and 4, the poet elaborates on the old master's perspective regarding suffering. The details outlined in these two lines indicate the human suffering is understood chiefly as an individual burden, a burden the rest of the world is oblivious or indifferent to. The actions noted in line 3 of an individual opening a window or just walking dully along are deliberately trivial and commonplace. They underscore the indifference society exhibits toward human suffering. The daily side by side existence of both extraordinary events of suffering and common experiences is the universal truth the old masters recognize and capture in their work. In lines 5 to 8, elaborating on the previous two lines, Auden notes how an extraordinary event such as the miraculous birth of Christ is visually displaced by the seemingly less significant image of children skating on a pond. This perspective is ironic and implies that the poet, like the painters, recognizes that great historic or prophetic events, which are often the focus of humanity, are less important than those which mark the recurring rhythms of life. Lines 9 to 13, like the previous four, treat an extraordinary event contextually. The dreadful martyrdom is placed within the human context of ordinariness. As a martyrdom occurs, dogs live out their doggy life. This juxtaposition of the ordinary and extraordinary suggests a condemnation of humankind's indifference to human suffering. However, it also forces the reader to question the accepted distinction between the ordinary and the extraordinary. The poet, like the old master, Bruegel engages us to recognize the details of daily life because it is here that extraordinary events of suffering and miracles occur. The extraordinary events are children skating or the animals stirring. The flagged colloquial language the poet employs, for instance, such phrase as anyhow in a corner and dogs go on with their doggy life, is deliberately unpoetic and suggests that the reader is discussing a well known idea. Recalling a familiar idea links back to the opening lines of the poem and the poet's assertion that a universally recognized and accepted truth regarding human suffering exists. In lines 14 to 15, Auden moves from the general to the specific. In the second section, the poet dwells upon a particular canvas, Bruegel's Icarus. This painting, as suggested in these two lines, contains a visual representation of the detached attitude of humankind discussed in the previous lines. Note how the indifference of humankind is expressed by their actions as everything turns away in a leisurely fashion from the disaster. In this section, the implied indifference noted in the first section of the poem is made explicit. Despite their seeming differences, the extraordinary events alluded to in each section are linked. In the first section, the poet alludes to Christian events, the Nativity and the Crucifixion. In the second section, the Greek myth of Icarus, a boy whose overwhelming aspirations proved to be his downfall, is depicted. While the events spring from disparate cultures and times, humankind's response to the events is the same because in all instances the fated implications are ignored. In lines 16 to 19, the poem mirrors the painting. Both depict the plowman and his work in the foreground, while the human tragedy of Icarus plunging to his death is regulated to the background. The painting is literally composed in this manner, and the poetic composition is equally as clearly as Icarus is depicted as simply a splash, a cry, a pair of white legs. Despite being regulated to the background of the text, the disaster, the martyrdom, the death and suffering are part of the landscape, even if those occupying the landscape are oblivious to it. Life fails to romanticize and celebrate such events, and this awareness further suggests that the extraordinary exists within the daily activities of one's life. The closing lines of the poem continue to meticulously describe Bruegel's painting. The attention to detail, for instance, the ship is defined as both expensive and delicate, underscores insignificance of personal tragedy within the scheme of life, and thus implies that the extraordinary exists within ordinary experience. This is the image the poem concludes with, because despite death of Icarus, the sun continues to shine and the ship sails calmly on to its preordained destination. One of the most interesting things about the poem is that it gives credit to artists, or at least to a particular school of artists, for understanding the experience of suffering better than people ordinarily do. Art is often accused of being out of touch with the realities of the world, of portraying life in a way that is either simplified or idealized. Transforming reality is the nature of art. Some artists feel that it is also the job of the artist to make the world appear better than it actually is, or to show how it could be better. Auden is standing beside the Renaissance painters who believed in showing one of the worst, most unpleasant aspects of human condition: the fact that the problems of one person do not actually affect anyone else in a significant way. The poem tells us by implication that the artist who tries to depict humans as understanding the importance of another's failures and cheating. Near the end of the poem, the style changes, using more adjectives, becoming more specific about what is contained in the fall of Icarus. White legs, green water, and delicate ship do not give readers the actual vivid experience of being Bruegel's painting, but they are more specific about the details than the earlier part of the poem had been. The poem moves from the general concepts such as suffering to examples, the skating children, the dog and horse, to details. In doing so, Auden is covering all of the artist's concern, from social philosophy down to particular shades and hues. He is also following the movement of a museum tour, from general categories down to focal points on specific works.